He who cheated and was cheated, who traded a future for a bowl and wore a disguise to steal a blessing, that man one night found himself alone beside a river, wrestling in the dark with a presence that would not be denied. That limp he carried into the dawn was a map of a life of striving, of cunning, of promises pursued at any cost, a life that, in the end, could not be explained away by schemes. This is the story of Jacob, the man who wrestled with God. Jacob's story begins in the dark of his mother's womb. Rebekah felt the twins kicking and turning, and the midwife's words were freighted with more than mere birth announcements. The oracle she received, a line that would echo through generations, sounded like this: "Two nations are in your womb, the older will serve the younger." Genesis 25:23. Those prenatal words did not merely describe destiny, they planted a tension that would shape family tables, marriages, prayers, and wars. They cast a shadow long before either boy drew a breath. When they were born, the contrast between them could not have been clearer. Esau came out first, rugged, covered with a hairiness that bespoke the wildness of the open country. He grew up by the hunts, his hands calloused from the bow, his appetite for the immediate pleasures of sunlight and game unmistakable. Jacob arrived after, his hand clutching Esau's heel as if trying to pull himself up into his brother's life. He was quieter, a man more at home by the tents, tending flocks, watching life in its smaller domestic rhythms. He learned early how to sit with patience and cunning in equal parts. Favoritism anchored itself in Isaac and Rebekah's hearts like a wedge. Isaac loved the game hunter's son, Esau. Rebekah's tenderness rested on Jacob. Favorite gifts, whispered confidences, different expectations, small acts that, over years, hardened into deep roots of rivalry. Against this soil of preference and prophecy, an event happened that would reveal both the brittle nature of promises and the terrible human instinct to secure what one believed to be owed. One day, Esau returned from the field exhausted, skin burned by the sun and hunger gnawing in his belly. Jacob, tending a pot of red stew, watched as his brother staggered to the tent. The bargain was almost casual, as if the two had made trades before, and as if the future could be bartered away like grain. Esau said, in the bluntness of immediate need, "Feed me some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Jacob, shrewd and patient, saw what hunger would exchange for, and answered in a voice that carried the edge of calculation, "Sell me your birthright." It sounds grotesque when you say it plainly, a bowl for a legacy, but the scene is honest about how desire distorts judgment. Esau, driven by appetite and the short arc of his desires, agreed. He drank, ate, and afterward, in the smoke of the tent, he had nothing to give back. A future had been traded for a moment. That small trade would echo for generations. The birthright was not only a title, it was a promise, a transmission of covenantal blessing tied to Abraham's line. To exchange it for a meal revealed a kind of spiritual poverty that hunger exposed. Some men live by the stomach, some live by the promise. Jacob, whether opportunist or providential steward, walked away holding a piece of the future that would bind him to choices both daring and dangerous. Fate, family, and fortitude collided again when Isaac aged and his sight failed. The patriarch's hands trembled with old age. His mind drifted toward the still resonant traditions of blessing the firstborn. Rebekah, listening close to the whisper of the promise she had heard years before, heard in the moment an urgency she would not ignore. She conspired with Jacob to ensure that the prophetic word, the younger serving the elder, would be fulfilled. The method was deceit. Jacob would go into Isaac pretending to be Esau and receive the blessing that traditionally belonged to the firstborn. That morning was peopled with senses. There was the smell of roasted game Rebekah prepared, the feel of goatskins pressed against Jacob's hands and neck to simulate Esau's roughness, the tremor of Isaac's voice as he asked, "Who is it?" The question of a man whose hearing had outlived his sight. Jacob answered, wearing the cloak of another's identity. He put on a lie as one might put on a garment, expecting that clothes could carry truth. Isaac, deceived by sense and circumstance, bestowed the words and promises meant for the eldest. We must say plainly, the Bible does not celebrate the trick. The narrative resists easy moral applause. Rebekah and Jacob acted out of a conviction that God's promise was at stake, but their method was betrayal. Esau returned from the hunt, bearing the smell of the wilderness, and discovered the theft. The earth under Jacob's feet shifted in an instant. A brother's wrath, red as blood and hot as desert wind, promised death. "When the days come for me to bless him, and he is dead," Esau vowed, "I will kill my brother Jacob." That threat was not merely family squabble, it was danger made flesh. It forced Jacob to flee before the fury could become final. So Jacob left the home of his fathers, a young man cast out into the wide tableau of the world with nothing but a staff, a coat, and the restless weight of a stolen blessing. He went east, toward Haran, to the household of Laban, a relative, and to whatever fate awaited him under foreign roofs and strange stars. Exile became his companion by necessity, but also, in an ironic twist, a classroom for the formation of a life. In the rugged school of displacement, he would learn that scheming breeds consequences, and that survival often demands persistence rather than cunning. Before his foot crossed the threshold of the unknown, though, something extraordinary happened. At Bethel, at night, when the sky seemed to stretch its dark like a canopy over someone half broken by fear, Jacob made a bed of stones. A heavy stone became his pillow, stone against cheek, earth against ear, a humbling sleep for a man who had taken power by trick. In that place where his smallness met the vastness above, he had a dream that cut through his shame and solitude. In the dream, a ladder or staircase appeared, its top reaching into heaven, and angels traveled upon it, a vivid picture of a bridge between earth and the world above. And then, as if the scene required words as much as images, God spoke. The promise heard earlier through Rebekah's womb was spoken again and with renewed clarity. The land on which Jacob lay would be given to him and his descendants, that through his seed all families of the earth would be blessed. The covenantal conversation resumed, not because Jacob deserved it, but because God's purpose tended to faithfulness even when human hands grasped wrongly. Jacob woke as if from two lives, one a thief, the other a man standing under a promise older than his shame. He made a vow then, not as a litigator defending his case, but as a frightened soul bargaining with the divine. "If God will be with me and keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace," he said, "then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone shall be God's house." Genesis 28:20-22. The vow is awkward and human. He asks for protection and provision and promises devotion in return. The prayer of a man whose faith is knotted with need. There is humility there too. Jacob sets a pillar of stone and pours oil upon it. He marks the place as Bethel, house of God, as if to anchor the promise in the geography of his life. Bethel becomes a hinge. It is a place where God's purposes re-enter Jacob's story, despite everything Jacob has done. It is also a place where Jacob's future will not be an easy, straight line. The promise arrives, but with no blanket pardon from the consequences of his choices. Exile still calls. The blessing is real. So too is the path to it, which will be paved by more labors, deeper blindsides, and unexpected lessons. And so Jacob continued on, moving east toward Haran. The road laid out before him was a mixture of desert days and star-chilled nights, of grazing flocks and faces that did not yet know his name. He was leaving more than a place. He was leaving the person he had been. Or perhaps he was clutching at that person, unwilling to let the old tricks go. The root patterns of his life, grasping, planning, bargaining, would not be erased by one night of dreaming under a stone. Haran itself was a world of wells and flocks, of kinship bonds that carried profit and danger together. It was there, at a well at the center of a town, that Jacob, weary from travel, paused. The sound of water pulled him as if by memory. Wells in the ancient Near East were not merely sources of drink, but places where gossip met the market, where marriages were proposed and bargains struck. As he approached, men walked with their flocks, but none reached into that particular circle of women drawing water. In the crowd, a figure moved with a grace that arrested him. Rachel, Laban's daughter, came with her father's sheep. The scene at the well is cinematic in its quiet choreography. Jacob, seeing her, felt something that was not merely appreciation for beauty, but an abrupt, visceral recognition, a sense that Providence had placed her in his path. He rolled the stone from the mouth of the well, an act showing both strength and willingness to serve. There is no exaggerated flourish here, just a moment where labor and tenderness meet. Rachel, coming to water the sheep, looked up, and for both of them the world tightened into the small compass of eyes and unspoken questions. Jacob's greeting to her was the simplest kind of introduction, a request to identify her. "Are you my kinsman?" he asked. When she answered no, yet with a softness that suggested kinship, Jacob revealed his identity. The meeting at the well would prove more than a passing encounter. It would be the first thread of a new life in a foreign land. Love, in Jacob's story, arrives entangled with complicated loyalties. It would soon bind him to Laban's household and to new patterns of deception in which he himself would be ensnared. But before love could settle into marriage and giving, Jacob found himself at the end of a day that would require more endurance than charm. Laban welcomed him with a hospitality that had uses Jacob did not yet understand. The house of Laban was a place of cunning traded back and forth like currency. Jacob, who had learned the art of crafting advantage from his mother and himself, would enter a long apprenticeship in which he would be both student and victim of trickery. Laban was not merely a hospitable uncle, he was an astute manipulator of family loyalties and labor. It is in Haran that the long, painful, necessary schooling begins. Jacob agreed to serve Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. Those years passed like a chapter of faithful toil, tending flocks, enduring homespun loneliness, counting the days until the promised wedding. The night of the marriage arrived as both fulfillment and betrayal. Laban, with the cunning of a man who could match Jacob's own, substituted Leah, the older sister, under the veil. Jacob awoke the next morning to find himself bound to a wife he had not chosen. Laban had traded one deception for another, and Jacob's outrage was muffled by the practice of a world in which kinship and marriage could be bartered. Jacob confronted Laban, and Laban's response was the sort thrown like a gauntlet back into Jacob's chest. In their land, it was not customary to marry off the younger sister before the older. Jacob's anger was met with an offer to work another 7 years for Rachel. Love, money, and labor braided together here. The cost of Rachel's hand was not merely payment, but years of servitude. Jacob agreed. He married Rachel as well. The domestic scene that followed was a complicated tapestry of affection and neglect, rivalry and longing. Leah bore children, Rachel remained barren for a time. Jacob wrestled with love split between two sisters and between the demands of work and the ache of fatherhood. Children came, as blessings often do, in the midst of moral ambiguity. Leah gave Jacob sons to name and claim: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and others, each name carrying a weight of hope, complaint, or prophecy. Bilhah and Zilpah, servants given as concubines to Jacob by Rachel and Leah respectively, bore more sons, and Rachel, finally, bore Joseph, whose future would one day gather the families fracturing into a strange, redemptive arc. The dozen sons and a daughter, Dinah, grew amid jealousy and competition, each birth a new knot in the family rope that pulled them together and tore them apart. In Haran, Jacob, who once used deception to secure his own advantage, experienced both the pain of being deceived and the slow crystallization of his character under toil. Laban altered his wages repeatedly, spinning cunning to keep Jacob's labor profitable to himself. Jacob responded with shrewd management of flocks, breeding, herding, selecting, and by the time he realized it, his hands had become calloused in new ways, not only by subterfuge, but by long days of stewardship. God, who had visited him at Bethel, now opened Jacob's fortunes to increase, despite the moral fog around him. Sheep multiplied. Flocks flourished. Jacob's household grew in size and responsibility. Yet prosperity did not smooth Jacob's conscience nor heal the old wounds of betrayal and estrangement. There were numerous moments that called Jacob to reckon with himself: the manipulation of breeding seasons to bias flock color in his favor, the subtle exploitation of Laban's greed, the quiet compromises that eroded the boundary between survival and cunning. Each decision sat like a pebble on his soul until the pile became a small hill. Signs he could not ignore. At night, when the lamp guttered low and children breathed in sleep, Jacob would sometimes remember Bethel, the ladder, the promise, and think of the stone now set as a pillar that marked the place where God had spoken. He might have felt the contradiction between the voice on the ladder and the choices he made by the watering trough. Years folded into one another. Jacob's family grew complex and volatile. Favoritism reappeared in the form of Rachel's deep love for Joseph and Joseph's special place as the son of his favored wife. Sibling rivalry reawakened into politics of its own. Insults thrown like spears, dreams shared in confidence and later used as tinder. Yet beneath the domestic noise, an inner drumbeat quickened in Jacob's chest, a mixture of fear and longing for home, a sense that the arc of his life was bending toward the place where his father still lived, and toward the brother he had wronged. Then, in a moment that pulls all the threads taut, God spoke again, not in a dream this time, but in the quiet command that stirred Jacob's heart. "Return to the land of your fathers, to your relatives, and I will be with you." The summoning to return set Jacob into motion. It was a summons riddled with dread. Esau's name still lived in the mouth of memory as a threat. The laundry list of sins, the birthright, the stolen blessing, the family betrayals, pressed like accretions on his conscience. Yet the voice that called him home promised accompaniment, a counterweight to the fear. Jacob, making preparations, could have chosen to go stealthily, to send troops, or to hide behind golden gifts and armed escort. Instead, prudence and penitence braided. He organized his household into groups, sent messengers with elaborate gifts to Esau, and bent his heart toward prayer. At the very least, he tried to do what his old life had rarely taught him to do, to anticipate reconciliation rather than revenge. As Jacob approached the land of his fathers, the sky over Mahanaim shimmered with a sense of protection. The name itself, two camps, would later mark the moment when he saw angels encamped, and he named the place accordingly. There was rest in the knowledge that the divine procession accompanied him. Yet fear is a stubborn thing. On the night before he would meet Esau, Jacob found himself alone by the Jabbok River, a place where the water runs swift and cold, cleaving rocks on its way to larger waters. Night here took on an edge. Shadows moved differently beside running water. He sent his family and possessions across the stream, staying behind with only his inner clutter and a palpable, pressing absence. It is here, on this bank where past and future press close to the present, that everything Jacob had hoped to outrun gathers. The river's sound is a kind of accusation, the steady noise of consequences arriving. Jacob, who had been the orchestrator of many plots, now faced a night when nothing could be engineered. There were no animal skins to tack to his arms, no prepared stew to trade, no practiced lies that would be believed. The arrival of what must come would be immediate and personal. He prayed then, not rhetorically but urgently, a prayer that crouched between pleading and bargaining. "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac," he said, invoking the covenantal names that had floated like beacons since childhood, "grant me safety on my journey." It was a short prayer, plain and raw, the posture of a man who knew that luck and craft would not suffice. Jacob's words were not an attempt to earn blessing, as if it were a ledger entry. They were the utterance of one who had finally learned the cost of self-reliance and who was ready, though not yet changed fully, to admit his need. And then the night deepened. He remained by the water's edge, senses sharpened, waiting for what he could not name. The hours stretched, the moon moved, the air grew thin with anticipation. What had been a life of bargaining and cunning contracted down to a single chilling intimacy, one man, one river, one night. Whatever would happen here would shape not only Jacob's next steps, it would carve into his body a memory to remember. Everything that had led Jacob here, the prophetic words in Rebekah's womb, the birthright for a bowl, the stolen blessing under old Isaac's hand, the exile and the dream at Bethel, the marriages and the long labor in Laban's household, the births and the rivalries, converged into that vigil by the Jabbok. He stood on the bank with fear at his heels and a promise ahead, uncertain whether what awaited him would be a reconciliation that washed away guilt or an encounter that would widen the wound. The night held its breath. The night held its breath. The river whispered against the stones, as if it too were listening for what would be confessed or fought for. Jacob stayed on the bank, alone except for his memories and the soft clamor of distant flocks. Fear had a shape now, thin as the moonlight, heavy as the coat on his shoulders, and when something moved at his side, he did not know whether to flinch or to reach. At first the stranger came close like any traveler might, a hand extended, a form stepping from shadow. Then the contact became pressure, and pressure became a grapple. It began with touch, then with search, then with force. Someone seized him, and Jacob found himself held against the night. Muscles bunched and burned, breath came in ragged pulls, and the dark around them smelled of riverweed and earth. The two bodies rolled and locked, the sound of fight small beneath the greater drum of Jacob's heart. Hands gripped, fingers found collars and wrists. The struggle had no audience but the moon. This was no ordinary scuffle. The man who wrestled with Jacob met his resistance with otherworldly persistence. He tested every sinew, answered every counter-move, and yet was not easily toppled. Jacob found, in the press of that hold, something unsettling. This adversary did not seem content merely to best him. There was a demand buried in the strength, an insistence that cut past Jacob's old tactics of trick and bargain and found the core of a different hunger. They fought until the first hints of dawn threaded the sky with gray. At some point in the dark, as limbs tangled and the river's voice pressed closer, the stranger touched Jacob's hip. The contact was precise, like the hand of a surgeon, and the strike of a sword at once. Jacob felt a snap of pain that traveled through the joint, an ache that would later mark his gait and his memory. He cried out, a human sound full of fear and surprise, and the dawn smudged the edges of that cry into the coming day. But pain did not make him let go. If anything, it sharpened his resolve. Jacob clung as he had never clung to stew or to a stolen blessing. He found a new stubbornness rising in his chest, less the cunning of his youth, and more the desperate tenacity of a man who knew the value of what was at stake. He wrapped his arms around the stranger like a vow, and would not release his grip until words were given. "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking," the man said. The voice was not merely human in its timbre. It carried an authority that made the grass at their feet seem to straighten. Yet Jacob, panting, answered in his old language, plea braided with demand. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he said. It was the same spirit that had driven him to grasp at promises before. The difference now was the company in which the grasping occurred and the cost he was willing to pay. The man asked his name, simple, pointed, and Jacob offered it, Jacob. The name itself, in its Hebrew roots, had always carried a double edge, a heel grasper, a pursuer, one who seizes. Jacob had been called that by a world that watched him pull himself up by another's ankle. It was a name linked to strategy and to a life of shortcuts, and when he spoke it now it sounded to him older and thinner, a label earned and weighed. "Your name will no longer be Jacob," the stranger replied. "Your name will be Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." The word landed like a stone in the chest. Israel. To Jacob it meant change, a new trajectory, a breaking of the old pattern into something that would not be erased by schemes. The man did not flinch from giving him a new identity, even as he marked him with pain. Jacob would later explain that prevailing meant refusing to let go until blessing was given. In that wrestling, he had not merely set his own will against a foe, he had demanded an encounter with the divine. The ambiguous nature of the opponent, an angel, a theophany, God in a form the eye could not name, was part of the wonder. Scripture leaves the identity of the stranger open to faithful wonderings. What matters in the narrative is less the precise ontology of that touch, and more the transformation it precipitated. A man whose life had been a web of graspings now bore a wound and a name that declared he had engaged the living God and had not been released without blessing. The blessing itself was simple and grave. The stranger said words that landed like a benediction and like a charge, a blessing that acknowledged struggle and bestowed mission. To be Israel was to be chosen for a people, to head a line through which nations would be shaped, not because Jacob had perfected himself, but because God's promise moves through imperfect vessels. It was both gift and weight. When the stranger released him, Jacob limped. The hip that had been touched that night would throb in cold weather, would remind him of the bargain he had pressed into the very body of his being. The first light of morning found Jacob alone on the bank, the pale river carrying away the prince of their fight. He rose stiffly, his gait altered, and in that limp was a new testimony: the cost of meeting God. The limp was not shame, but a scar of grace, an inscription on his flesh that announced both wounding and blessing. He called the place Peniel. I have seen God face to face, yet my life was spared. There is irony here. The man who had once sought blessings through trickery now carried into daylight the raw witness of a night-long pleading that neither trick nor barter could replace. In the light he knew, too, that the night had altered the terms of his journey to Esau. He approached the meeting not with the cool calculation of a man who could manipulate outcomes, but with a new humility. He divided his camp, sent gifts ahead, and arranged his household in ways that spoke of care for those he had wronged. Yet when the messenger returned with news that Esau was coming with 400 men, Jacob's heart tightened. He prayed again, simple and vulnerable. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother. It was not an attempt to buy safety. It was a plea from a man whose life had been taught in sharp classrooms. When the two brothers finally saw each other across the field, the scene startled the imagination. Esau ran to meet him, and though Jacob had prepared for war, Esau threw himself upon him, and embraced him, and fell upon his neck, and kissed him, and the two wept. The language is almost too plain for the depth of the moment. Tears, embrace, the collapse of generations of grievance into a human gesture of reconciliation. Esau's heart had been softened, the narrative says, and the pain that had been expected, blood for blood, hate's final closure, did not come. Instead came embrace, and a conversation that sounded of forgiveness and of mutual acknowledgement. Esau refused the gifts at first, or accepted them as gestures of goodwill. In either case, the meeting cleared a path not to perfect reunion, old wounds remained, but to a new way forward where the brothers could live in separate lands without the requirement of mutual destruction. That reconciliation did not erase the moral ledger. Jacob had to live with what his hands had wrought and with the history he had brought with him. After the reunion, he traveled to Succoth and then to Shechem, where the family pitched their tents and Jacob bought land. In Shechem, a new wound opened. Dinah, Jacob's daughter, went out to visit the women of the land and was seen by Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite. The account is stark and painful. Shechem defiled Dinah, language that names the violence done and the shame that followed. Shechem then asked to marry Dinah. His father, Hamor, proposed an alliance that would bind the two peoples together. He spoke as negotiators often do, weaving marriage with trade as if a bride could be exchanged for civic peace. But the response from Dinah's brothers, above all from Simeon and Levi, was terrible and swift. They deceived the men of the city with a condition. All must be circumcised, they said, as a sign of alliance. On the third day, when the men of the city were weak from the operation, Simeon and Levi rose and killed every male and took Dinah back. The text is sober in its telling. There is no theatrical flourish. The act is reported with the plainness of calamity. When Jacob heard of the violence, he rebuked his sons, worried that they had made his household odious to the Canaanites and Perizzites, and that surrounding peoples might rise against them. His sons answered with a moral clarity tangled with brutality. Had Shechem not treated their sister as if she were a prostitute? Should their sister be treated like one? The argument exposed a family in which wrath and justice, vengeance and honor, were braided together into acts that would stain their future. The Shechem episode must be treated with sober restraint. It is one of those moments in the story where the cost of living by the sword is shown plainly. Jacob's critique is not that his sons had no cause for pain. It is that they compounded violence with strategy that could bring ruin upon all the clans. The moral landscape here is messy. Justice and vengeance can look alike. Defense and aggression can be hard to separate. Jacob's voice, the voice of a man who had wrestled with God and been given a new name, was not a triumphant one. He feared the consequences, measured and long. He would carry that fear with him. The family had been partially reconciled at the meeting with Esau, but reconciliation with neighbors and nations would require more than a handshake. The march toward home continued, though sorrow and grief walked with the caravan. Rachel, Jacob's beloved, bore him a son in the journey, and named him Benjamin, son of my right hand, though Rachel died in childbirth on the way, and was buried at Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. The image of Jacob's beloved dying in labor is one of the tenderest sorrows of his life. He wrapped his arms around her in the moment of loss, wept, and set stones for her grave. The family's joy at Benjamin's arrival was mixed with the deep, incandescent ache of Rachel's absence. Her death would cast long shadows over Jacob's later years. The places where love is given and taken away imprint the itinerary of a man's life with grief. Other divisions inside the family festered. Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, committed an act that would cost him standing. He lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. The act was more than scandal. In ancient kinship systems, it was an affront to paternal authority and a claim upon legacy. Jacob's anger at Reuben was swift. The offense would be remembered when it came time to apportion blessing. The household was no simple patchwork of unbroken love. Favored sons and slighted ones, alliances formed by mothers and sisters, concubines and legitimate heirs, all these created an economy of rivalry where dreams and jealousy could become the currency of strife. Then came the story of Joseph, perhaps the most dramatic turn in Jacob's latter years. Joseph, the son of Rachel, was favored by his father, who made him a coat of many colors, an act that, in context, carried visible weight, a public sign of distinguished affection. Joseph's dreams compounded the problem. He told of sheaves that bowed to his, and of celestial bodies leaning in obeisance. The dreams were innocent, perhaps, in Joseph's telling, but to brothers living in a climate of rivalry they sounded like arrogance. Jealousy sharpened like a blade, and the brothers conspired. In some versions of the telling, motifs of despair and hatred, the raw color of envy, push men to extremes. Some planned to kill him, others chose a different path. Joseph was sold to Midianite traders and taken down into Egypt, his coat dipped in blood and presented to Jacob as a lie that would break a father's heart. Jacob's grief at Joseph's disappearance was a deep, almost private agony. For years he mourned, his outer dignity weighed down by inner ruin. He refused to be comforted, believing his favorite son dead, a sacrifice on the altar of sibling hate. Yet God had woven a strange redemption through Joseph's tragedy. In Egypt, Joseph rose through hardship and imprisonment to become second to Pharaoh, a man of wisdom who could read dreams and manage grain through a famine ordained by providence. When the famine came and the brothers traveled to Egypt for food, they stood before Joseph unaware of the identity of the powerful man who interrogated and tested them. Joseph staged a series of trials, accusing, imprisoning, revealing, so that the depth of their repentance and the workings of providence might be demonstrated. When Joseph finally revealed himself, the scene was electric with mercy. He wept. He forgave. He told his brothers that what they had meant for evil, God had meant for good, to preserve many lives. Yet even in this moment of grace, the narrative does not excuse their sin. Rather, it frames God's sovereignty as one that can redeem without negating human culpability. That theological tension, culpability held alongside extraordinary mercy, is at the heart of Jacob's family story. Joseph invited his family to Egypt. Jacob, old and brittle with grief and with joy, moved his household and his father's bones to live under the protection of his son. The family's migration to Egypt was not only an act of survival, but the beginning of the formation of a people whose identity would be linked to both promise and exile. In Egypt, Jacob's life converged again on themes of blessing, naming, and legacy. He blessed Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, adopting them as his own, and thereby giving them an inheritance among Jacob's sons. When Jacob laid his hands upon them, there is a tender paradox. The old man, who once deceived and was deceived, delicately placed his right hand upon the younger son Ephraim and his left upon Manasseh, crossing his hands in a gesture that foresaw the shaping of future tribes. Joseph corrected him, thinking to place Manasseh first, but Jacob persisted. He saw in vision the relative destinies of the sons and made pronouncement accordingly. The episode shows Jacob now in the role of patriarch. He names, he blesses, and he speaks prophetic words that will bear into history. Before his death, Jacob called his sons together to bless them. Each son received words that sounded like judgment and promise, reflections of character and future. Reuben, for his instability, lost his preeminence. Judah, for his leadership and the scepter, was promised a line of rulership. Joseph received manifold blessing and was likened to a fruitful bough whose branches would run over the wall. The oracles are not evenly kind. They are perceptive, cutting, and maternal, with a father's mixture of tenderness and severity. Jacob, who had wrestled with God and whose name had become Israel, saw with a clarity that came from years of grappling with consequence. His words would shape narratives of tribes and of the nation to come. Jacob's final instruction was practical as well as pious. He refused to be buried in Egypt. He made his sons swear to carry his bones back to the land promised to Abraham and Isaac, to lie with their fathers in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. That insistence on burial in the ancestral soil tied the family back to the covenantal promise, signaling that Israel would remain, at heart, a people bound to a land not yet wholly theirs. They embalmed him, and the Egyptians observed the mourning for 70 days. Then Joseph and his brothers carried their father's body into Canaan and buried him with the rites of their fathers. The journey back to the land of promise was a pilgrimage of memory, of claim, and of faith. Jacob died, an end that, like his life, was knotty with sorrow and hope. His death was not the end of the story, but the handing off of identity. He had become Israel, a name that would be spoken by a people whose history would be shaped by struggle, blessing, exile, and covenant. His body returned to the soil that had been promised to his ancestors, his identity rooted at last among the stones and wells of the past. Yet his spirit passed into a history where his children would inherit both his flaws and his blessings. What, then, is the meaning of a life like Jacob's for us? The narrative resists simple moralizing. It will not allow us to chalk his victories up to cunning or to dismiss his wounds as divine compensation for ambition. Jacob's life teaches that God's purposes often thread through human weakness. The covenant continued not because Jacob was sinless, but because God kept promise through a messy, human lineage. That truth is not an excuse for wrong. It is the remarkable mystery that grace can meet failure and yet move history forward. There is also a lesson about the nature of blessing. Jacob sought blessing by craft and youth, by bargaining and stealth, as though blessings could be bought. Yet the blessing that finally redefined him came through a different pathway: struggle. His night at the Jabbok was not a market exchange, but a raw, intimate wrestling that wounded him and changed his name. Blessing came at the cost of persistence and pain. The divine encounter demanded honesty rather than trickery, a stubborn refusal to let go, coupled with a humility to be wounded. The hip that was touched became both a limitation and a memorial, the body bearing testimony to a soul's turning. Reconciliation, too, cost Jacob. His reconciliation with Esau did not erase years of manipulation. It required gifts, tears, and the willingness to be vulnerable before a brother who had been wronged. The Shechem episode and the family divisions show that transformation is not a tidy erasure of past harm. Wounds have consequences, and families inherit both blessings and debts. Jacob's later blessings and his insistence on burial in the Promised Land show a patriarch trying to repair and to bind his lineage to a future that will require continual wrestling with God and with neighbor. There is a pastoral edge here for those who would sit with this story by the hearth. Who among us has not traded tomorrow for a bowl, exchanged a promise for a momentary relief? Who has not tried to secure what we think is owed by cunning rather than patience? Jacob's life asks us whether we will continue to live by the quick winds of appetite or whether we will learn a harder economy, one where blessing is sometimes won through struggle and surrender. The story does not offer a formula. It gives us instead a portrait. God can work through imperfect people, but the work reshapes them, and often the reshaping costs. And there is hope. The man who emerged from the night by the Jabbok did not become saintly in a single instant. His name changed, his limp remained, his family continued to fracture and to heal in cycles. Yet his identity as Israel positioned him as the father of a people whose life would be defined by covenant and by the practice of wrestling with God. The literal and the metaphorical intersect. A nation that would be tested, that would cry out, repent, and be restored in season. Jacob's story, then, is both cautionary and encouraging. It holds together failure and redemption, grief and blessing, the cost of reconciliation and the unexpected generosity of God. If Jacob's wrestling moves you, think with me for a moment about what it would look like to come to God not with strategies, but with honesty. To present our limp as testimony rather than as shame. To demand blessing not as a right, but as a plea. To accept the wound that comes with transformation. Our struggles, ethical, relational, spiritual, are often where our names are rewritten. The place of wrestling is rarely comfortable. It is a bank where the river of our life runs swift and demands that we meet it with bare hands. Jacob's final words to his sons were both particular and universal. He named their futures with sorrow and with hope, as fathers do when they know the frailty of gift. He asked them to keep covenant, to remember the stones and wells, and to carry their patriarchs' bones to the soil of promise. His insistence on being buried in the ancestral land was itself an act of faith, that the promise speech over Abraham and Isaac still held, and that his descendants must live in a tension between exile and claim. The pilgrimage of his bones was a symbol. Death is not the closure of God's purposes, but part of the journey of a people. As the story closes, the image that lingers is not of a man triumphant in the way the world counts triumph, wealth, power, perfect family, but of a man transformed. Israel walked with a limp, spoke with a hymn of memory and warning, and left a legacy that would be written into the bones of a nation. His life says this: God's promise often comes into our lives through struggle, through the places where we refuse to let go until grace speaks a name over us. The blessing is costly, the change irreversible. The limp remains, but so does the witness that a life can be reshaped. If Jacob's wrestling moved you, share this story with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to follow more deep character studies from Scripture, stories that tell us without flinching what it looks like to wrestle with God and with one another, and to be changed. May the memory of a man who grabbed his brother's heel, who bartered promises for stew, who fled and was pursued by both grief and promise, and who finally stood by a river and refused to let go, remind us that our own nights of wrestling are not wasted. They may well be the place where God writes a new name upon us.